Chapter 7. Anastasia's Russia. As Anastasia was telling me about the communities of the future which would be comprised of family domains, I asked her, "Anastasia, please show me the Russia of the future. I know you can." "Yes, I can." "What place in the future Russia would you like to see, Vladimir?" "Well, how about Moscow?" "Would you like to go to the future alone, Vladimir, or together with me?" "It would be a lot better with you. You can explain anything I see and don't understand." The touch of Anastasia's warm hand at once induced a sleepy state, and I started to see. Anastasia showed me the future of Russia, the same way she showed me the life on another planet. At some point, scientists will probably understand just how she does this, but the means she used are quite irrelevant in this case. In my view, the most important thing is information about what specific actions will enable us to bring about this splendid future. The Moscow yet to come was nothing like I had imagined. The city had not expanded its geographical boundaries. There were no skyscrapers as I might have expected. The walls of the old houses were decorated in cheerful colors. Many were painted with pictures, landscapes, and flowers. I later found out that this was the work of foreigners. First, they covered the walls with some kind of plaster, then artists, also from abroad, added the ornamentation. Intertwining vines hung down the roofs of many of the houses, their leaves rustling in the wind as though greeting passers-by. Almost all the streets and avenues of the capital were planted with trees and flowers. Right down the middle of Kalinin Avenue, or the New Arbat, as it is called, stretched a green boulevard about 4 meters wide. Footnote: New Arbat, a broad thoroughfare leading west from the Kremlin and city center to the Novi Arbat Bridge across the Moskva River. Moskva is also the Russian name of the city itself, officially known as Kalinin Prospect Avenue in Soviet times. Novi Arbat was constructed in 1963 parallel to the old Arbat Street, which still runs a short distance to the south, and from 1974 to 86 was turned into a pedestrian mall. Novi Arbat's imposing row of modern high-rise apartment blocks gave 1960s Moscow a new Western appearance, complete with contemporary-looking shops and restaurants. Concrete curbs rose about a half meter above the pavement, enclosing earthen beds, from which sprouted grass and wildflowers, interspersed at brief intervals with various kinds of trees. Rowans, with their clusters of red berries, birches, poplars, currants, and raspberry bushes, and a host of other plants, such as one might find in a natural forest. There were similar boulevard strips down the center of many Moscow's avenues and broad streets. And on the reduced traffic portion of these streets, there didn't seem to be very many motor cars, mainly buses carrying passengers who did not look at all Russian in their appearance. The same could be said of many of the pedestrians on the sidewalks. I wondered for a moment whether Moscow had been occupied by a technically more developed country, but Anastasia reassured me, saying that these people I was seeing here were not occupiers, but simply foreign tourists. "What draws them to Moscow?" I asked. "The atmosphere of grand creation, refreshing air and water," came the reply. "Look and see how many people are standing along the banks of the Moskva River and collecting water in containers on strings they let down from the high embankments, and drinking the river water with great delight." "But how can they drink water straight from the river without boiling it first?" "Look and see, Vladimir, how pure and transparent the water in the Moskva River is. It contains living water, not water deadened by gases like the kinds sold in bottles throughout the world." "It must be a fantasy. This is something impossible to believe." "A fantasy? But when you were little, would you and your friends have believed Believed it if someone told you that before long, people would be selling water in bottles? You're right. When I was young, nobody would have believed that. But how is it possible to make the water so pure in such a big city as Moscow? Stop polluting it. Stop throwing harmful waste into it. Stop littering the riverbanks. It was that simple. Exactly. Nothing fantasy-like. It is actually all quite simple. Today, the Moskva River is protected even from the runoff water flowing over the pavement, and it is closed to dirty ships. They used to consider the Ganges in India sacred, but now the whole world adores the Moskva River and its water. They adore the people who restored the water to its pristine vitality. And people come here from many countries to see this wondrous marvel, taste the water, and find healing. Where are all the local residents? Why are there so few passengers and cars in the streets? There are only about 1.5 million Muscovites actually living in the capital now, though the number of tourists from various countries can be more than 6 times that figure, replied Anastasia, and added, there are fewer cars because the remaining residents have managed to arrange their day on a more rational basis, reducing their need to move around. Their work is usually close by, close enough to walk, and the tourists get around using the metro and the buses. And what's happened to all the other Muscovites? They live and work within their splendid family domains. Who works in the plants and the factories? Who looks after the tourists? And Anastasia told me the following. As the year 2000, according to the accepted Earth calendar of the time, was drawing to a close, the Russian leadership was still in the process of determining the country's path of future development. The majority of Russian citizens were not particularly inspired by the path the so-called prosperous countries in the West were taking. Russians had already tried the food products from these countries, but did not have much taste for them. It turns out that the development of what was being termed technical progress in these countries had come hand in glove with various diseases, both of the body and the soul. Crime and drugs became increasingly rampant. Women were less and less inclined toward childbearing. Russians were not attracted to the conditions in which the peoples of the developed nations lived. Neither did they wish to revert to the old social order, but they had not yet seen any new path. An increasing mood of depression took hold of the country, affecting the whole society in ever greater numbers. Russia's population was aging and dying. At the beginning of the new millennium, at the initiative of the Russian president, a decree was signed granting free and unconditionally to each willing family 1 hectare of land whereon to establish a family domain. The decree allotted this land to the family for lifetime use, with the right to pass on to their heirs. Any produce grown in this domain would not be subject to taxation of any kind. 2 different footnotes. The whole description of the Russia of the future in this chapter and elsewhere in the series bears striking similarities to the ideas of one of Russia's greatest economists, Alexander Shayanov, 1888 to 1937. Back in the 1920s, he already foresaw the eventual return of the country to predominantly rural living after the fall of communism, and even described the Moscow of the future as a garden city populated mostly by tourists. He also accurately predicted the rise of the dacha movement that would eventually dominate the country's agriculture. Some of these views are expressed in his insightful A Journey of My Brother Alexei to the Land of Peasant Utopia, dubbed Utopia, only to allow the publication of the work under the Soviet censorship in 1920. After Stalin publicly attacked Shayanov's views in 1929, he was incarcerated and, after years in prison, executed on Stalin's personal order. Today, Shayanov's works are better known abroad than in his native Russia. Footnote number 2, on July 7th, 2003, less than 3 years after this book was released in Russia, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed into federal law the Private Garden Plot Act. According to this law, Russian citizens can receive free of charge from the state plots of land in private inheritable ownership. The maximum size of plots differs from one region to another, but in most cases between 1 and 3 hectares. The produce grown on the plots is not subject to taxation. Subsequently, on President Putin's instructions, the Russian government developed and introduced into the Russian parliament another law to further facilitate the acquisition of land for gardening. This second law was passed in June of 2006. End footnotes. Russian parliament supported the president's initiative and the Russian constitution was amended accordingly. The primary aims of the decree in the eyes of the president and the parliamentarians were reducing unemployment in the country, guaranteeing a minimum income level to needy families, and solving the refugee problem. But what subsequently happened was something none of them could have fully imagined. When the first allocation of land was made for organizing a community numbering more than 200 families, the plots of land in question were taken up not just by the needy, the unemployed, or poverty-stricken refugees, but primarily by middle-income families and wealthy entrepreneurs who had read your books, Vladimir. They had been anticipating this turn of events, and they were not just idly waiting for it. Many of them had already been growing their own family trees in their apartments from seeds planted into clay pots, and these mighty cedars and oaks of the future were already sprouting their first little shoots. It was these entrepreneurs who initiated and financed plans for a community with an infrastructure facilitating a convenient lifestyle, as you wrote in your book, Co-Creation. These plans provided for a store, a medical clinic, a school, a club, roads, and a lot else besides. In fact, entrepreneurs made up about half of the number of people who expressed their desire to rearrange their life and daily routine to live in the first of the new communities. They all had their own businesses, their own source of income. For the actual construction work and setting up their plots of land, they required a labor force. The ideal solution, they discovered, was to hire their neighbors from among the needy families as construction and landscape workers. That way, some of these families got jobs right away, which gave them the wherewithal to finance their own construction projects. The entrepreneurs realized that nobody would prove to be more meticulous and efficient workers than those who were planning to live in the communities themselves. And so external specialists would be hired where such could not be found among the future community residents. Only the establishing of the future orchard and forest and the planting of the family trees and living fences was something each family endeavored to do on their own. Most of them did not yet have enough experience or knowledge as to how best establish their plot. And as a result, among the future residents, the elderly people who did have this knowledge commanded considerable respect. The principal focus was not on temporary structures or even houses per se, but on the development of the landscaping. In each case, the actual buildings people were going to live in were considered just one small part of the larger living house of God. Within 5 years, houses for permanent residents had been built on all of the lots. They were quite varied in size and architectural style, but it was soon evident that the greatest treasure of each domain was by no means the size of the house. The greatest treasure lay elsewhere, and it was not long before it took form and outlined in the splendid landscaping elements of each plot in particular, as well as of the community as a whole. The oaks and cedars planted in each plot were still very young, and each plot was surrounded by a living fence, which was only starting to grow. But with each new spring, apple and cherry trees, even though still quite small, came stridently in bloom in the young orchards, along with grass and flower beds that were doing their very best to resemble a splendid living carpet. The spring air was filled with delightful aromas and floral pollen. The air became truly invigorating. And every woman living in this new community had a desire to bear children. This happened not only in young families, but even people considered elderly suddenly began to bear children. People felt that even if they themselves did not live to see the splendid piece of their motherland their hands had created, they wanted their children to. They wanted their children to delight in the sight and continue the co-creation begun by their parents. At the beginning of the new millennium, in each plot, all living shoots represented the first shoots of a splendid, happy future for the whole earth. The people that established for centuries to come the first family domains had still not completely felt the significance of what they had done. They simply began looking more joyfully at the world around them. They were still not consciously aware of the great joy their actions were bringing to their Heavenly Father. The Father was sending tears of joy and tenderness upon the earth amidst the drops of falling rain. And he smiled with the sunshine and was endeavoring to use the little branches of young trees to give a secret caress to his children who had suddenly become aware of eternity and had come back to him. The Russian press began writing about the new community, and many people wanted to see this splendid phenomenon for themselves so that they could create one of their own like it, perhaps even create a better one. Footnote, this too came to pass. On the 12th of November 2002, less than 2 years after this book was published in Russian, the Moscow Times, Russia's largest English-language daily newspaper, featured an article entitled Urban Group Dreams of Eco-Friendly Settlement on Rodno, one of Russia's first eco-villages created by inspired readers of the Ringing Cedars series. This article, describing the emerging Russia-wide eco-village movement, which sprang from the ideas expressed in Vladimir Megré's books, was followed by hundreds of other reports in newspapers and in the mass media. Both Rodno and other eco-communities now receive a steady flow of visitors from all over Russia and abroad. End footnote. Millions of Russian families were seized with the inspired desire for a splendid co-creation. Communities similar to the first one sprang up simultaneously in various regions of the country. An entire movement began, not unlike our contemporary dacha movement. Within 9 years after the first decree was signed, allowing people to establish their lives independently and make their lives happy, more than 30 million families had become involved in creating their own kins domains, their own piece of the motherland. They have been cultivating their splendid plots of ground, using in the process living, everlasting materials created by God. And by doing so, they were creating together with him. Each of these families turned their hectare of land provided for their lifetime use into a little corner of paradise. Against the backdrop of the vast spaces of the Russian motherland, a single hectare seemed like a very small piece indeed. But there were many such pieces, and all of them together made up a vast motherland. Through these pieces, all created by loving hands, the whole motherland flourished like a garden in paradise. This was their Russia. On each of the hectares were planted both evergreens and deciduous trees. People were already aware how the trees themselves would fertilize the ground, and the balance in the soil composition would be maintained by the grasses growing all around. And nobody had it even crossed their mind to use chemical fertilizers or toxic chemicals. The quality of Russia's air and water improved and became health-giving. The food shortage problem was completely resolved. Each family was able, easily and without undue effort, not only to provide for themselves from what grew in their domain, but also to sell their surplus. Every Russian family with its own domain started to become rich and free, and Russia as a whole began to grow in the most rich and powerful state in comparison with other countries in the world.